11:43 p.m. Genovese sent his top hitman for Bumpy Johnson. What came back wasn't a body. It was a coffin with Bumpy inside, alive, and a recorder still running. Every man in that room said the same thing. That was the night power changed hands. To understand why we need to go back. 6 weeks earlier, St. Vincent's Hospital, 2 a.m. The hallway smelled like bleach and something else, something sweet and rotting underneath. The kind of smell that tells you a body is losing its fight. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting that cold white glow that made every face look already dead behind door. 14B. A 6-year-old boy was drowning in his own lungs. His chest rose and fell in short, desperate jerks. The oxygen tube taped to his face had left red marks on his cheeks. His small fingers curled and uncurled against the white sheet, grabbing at nothing, finding nothing. Ray DeLuca sat in a plastic chair beside that bed and watched his son die by the inch. Ray's hands that had broken 3 men's jaws, hands that had fired a .38 into the back of a skull at close range without flinching. Those hands were trembling. He hadn't slept in 4 days. His eyes were red and hollow. His shirt was wrinkled and damp. On the floor beside his chair sat an open envelope with a single number written on the paper inside $60,000. That was what it cost to keep his son breathing for another 6 weeks. Ray had already sold everything. His car, his wife's ring, the gold band she'd worn for 11 years that she didn't know was gone yet. He'd gone to his crew, the men he'd taken bullets beside, and every single one of them looked away. Not one reached into his pocket. In this business, loyalty has an expiration date, and Ray's had run out the moment he stopped being useful. So when a man in a charcoal suit appeared at the end of that hallway at 2:17 a.m., materializing out of the shadows like he'd been there all along, Ray didn't ask how he'd gotten past the night nurse. He already knew. Men like this one didn't use front doors. They used money. The man sat down beside Ray without being invited. He placed a thick white envelope on the chair between them. Said nothing. Just let it sit there, like a loaded weapon. Ray stared at it. His jaw tightened. The machines beeped steadily in the room behind him. "How much?" Ray asked. $60,000. Cash. Right now. The man's voice was flat, stripped of all warmth, like concrete. "Mr. Genovese understands what you're going through. He's a father himself." Ray picked up the envelope. The weight of it hit him in the chest like a fist. "What does he want?" "One name, one job. You're home before your son wakes up." Ray opened the envelope, ran his thumb across the bills crisp. Real, ruthless. He could smell the ink. He could feel every single dollar. "What's the name?" he asked quietly. "Ellsworth Johnson," the man said. Then a pause, deliberate and cold. "Bumpy." The envelope dropped half an inch in Ray's grip. Every serious man in New York knew what that name meant. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a target. He was a fortress. He had survived 3 hits in 15 years. He had never once retaliated with a bullet, which somehow made him more terrifying. Not less. The Italian set his aim the way you mention a storm, not with hatred, but with respect for what it could destroy. "That's not a job," Ray said. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "That's a coffin." The man in the charcoal suit stood up and smoothed his jacket with both hands. "60,000 says it isn't," he said, and walked away. Ray sat alone in that plastic chair for 47 minutes. He listened to the machine breathing for his son. He smelled the bleach and the rot and the cold institutional air. He thought about his wife asleep at home, still believing the lie that he sold insurance. Then he put the money in his jacket and stood up. What Ray DeLuca didn't understand, couldn't understand. Sitting in that broken plastic chair with his son dying behind him was that Vito Genovese already had 20 men who could kill Bumpy Johnson. What Genovese needed wasn't a shooter. He needed a name he could burn. A man desperate enough to say yes, visible enough to take the blame, and disposable enough to disappear when it was over. The $60,000 wasn't a payment. It was a leash, and Ray had just put it around his own neck. A murder contract doesn't start with a gunshot. It starts with a father who has nothing left to lose. Harlem, 7 a.m. The street smelled like coffee, exhaust, and fresh bread from the Dominican bakery on the corner of 116. A fruit vendor stacked mangoes in a pyramid beside his cart, humming under his breath. Two kids chased a dog past a stoop where an old woman sat fanning herself with a folded newspaper. The morning light came in low and gold, cutting long shadows across the pavement. Nothing looked like war. That was exactly how Bumpy Johnson had engineered it. He sat at his usual table by the window in a small restaurant on 118th Street, scrambled eggs, black coffee. The Amsterdam News folded beside his plate. He wore a pressed white shirt. His reading glasses sat low on his nose. A Coltrane record turned slow and quiet on a phonograph in the corner. To anyone looking in through that window, he was just an older gentleman eating breakfast. But Bumpy Johnson hadn't survived 15 years in the most contested territory in New York by being what he appeared. He set down his coffee cup. His eyes moved barely, just a slight shift to the barber shop across the street. A man in a gray jacket was standing near the entrance. The shop didn't open until 9. The man wasn't reading anything, wasn't looking at his watch, wasn't talking to anyone. He was just standing, watching. Bumpy picked up his fork and cut into his eggs. "The man in the gray jacket," he said quietly, not looking up. "How long?" Across the table. Calvin, 11 years at Bumpy's side. A man who spoke in facts and nothing else, didn't look up from his coffee either. Third morning straight. Different jacket each day. Same shoes. Brown leather. Left sole worn down on the outside edge. He shifts his weight to the right when he stands. Old injury. "Same shoes," Bumpy repeated. "Sloppy," Calvin said. Bumpy chewed slowly, swallowed, took a sip of coffee. "Find out who he owes. Find out if he has children. Don't touch him." Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Not even a conversation?" "No," Bumpy said. "I want to know everything about him before he knows I've seen him." That single instruction, calm, precise, delivered over scrambled eggs, was the difference between Bumpy Johnson and every other powerful man in New York City. The others sent men with guns. Bumpy sent men with questions. While his enemies were planning attacks, he was building files. While they were making threats, he was collecting the kind of information that made threats unnecessary. He had never fired a weapon in public, not once in 15 years, not because he was gentle the men who thought that were mostly dead, but because pulling a trigger meant the situation had already slipped out of your hands. By Thursday, Calvin had everything. Ray DeLuca, 41, a contractor, not the kind that builds things, the kind that buries them. Sick child, hemorrhaging money, fresh connection to a Genovese crew operating out of a social club in Little Italy. 3 weeks of surveillance logs. One photograph taken from a distance showing Ray outside St. Vincent's Hospital, staring at the ground with the posture of a man who has already given up on everything except one thing. Bumpy read the file over dinner, set it down beside his plate. "He's not here because he wants to be," he said quietly. Someone handed him a deadline and pointed him at me. Calvin's jaw tightened. "How do you want to handle it?" Bumpy looked out the window at the dark street below. The fruit vendor was gone. The kids were gone. Harlem at night was a different animal, quieter, but with teeth. I want him to see me first, Bumpy said. Before he sees a target. Power isn't about how strong you are. It's about finding the exact place where the other man is already cracking and pressing there, slowly, until he breaks himself. The Red Rooster on 125th Street smelled like cigarette smoke, spilled bourbon, and 50 years of secrets. The lights were low and amber, the kind that softened faces and blurred edges, made it easy to pretend that the man across the room wasn't someone you should be afraid of. Jazz poured out of the speakers, not loud enough to dance to, just loud enough to swallow a conversation whole. Bumpy Johnson walked in at 9:47 p.m. Alone. No Calvin, no escort, just a man in a good suit carrying a book under his arm, nodding to the bartender, moving unhurried to the corner table in the far left of the room back against the wall. Full view of the front door, 2 steps from the side exit. He had been building this moment for 9 days. The rumor had traveled exactly the way he'd designed it to travel through 4 separate mouths, each one believing they were passing along a real secret. The rumor said Bumpy kept a physical ledger. Names, dates, payments. A complete record of every backroom arrangement between Harlem's operation and certain members of the Genovese family. The rumor said he carried it every Tuesday night to the Red Rooster. Every word of it was a lie, but it was a lie with weight, and weight travels fast in a world built on paranoia. At 10:02 p.m., Ray DeLuca came through the door. Dark brown coat, same worn left sole. His eyes swept the room once professional, practiced, and landed on Bumpy in the corner. He moved to the bar, ordered something he didn't drink, positioned himself at the correct angle, the correct distance. His right hand disappeared below the bar counter. 3 feet. That was all. At a distance of 3 feet, the .22 caliber bullet did not miss its target. Ray had done this job 6 times before. He knew exactly how the next 40 seconds would sound: the soft crack, the scrape of the stool, the gasp that moves through a crowded room like a wave. He knew how the side exit would feel under his palm. Cold metal, swinging outward. He knew how the night air would hit his face when he stepped out into the alley. He reached into his coat. A serving tray hit the floor. The crack of 6 glasses exploding against hardwood split the room like a gunshot. Bodies flinched hard. A woman screamed. A man knocked his chair back, standing up. Bourbon spread across the floor in a dark, spreading stain, and for 1 full second every eye in the Red Rooster was pulled toward the young waiter, standing frozen in the wreckage of his own clumsiness. Ray's hand stopped inside his coat. When he turned back to the corner table, Bumpy Johnson was already looking directly at him, not startled, not reaching for anything, not calling for help, just looking with the calm, level, almost bored expression of a man watching something he'd already seen play out in his mind 3 days ago. Then Bumpy reached forward, lifted his bourbon glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Never broke eye contact. The cold started in Ray's stomach and spread outward. He understood all at once, fully, with nauseating certainty that the tray had not fallen by accident. The waiter had been placed there. The timing had been exact. This entire night had been built like a stage production, and Ray was the only one who hadn't read the script. 48 hours later, a plain envelope appeared in Ray's mailbox. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with 3 lines typed clean: his son's surgeon's name, his son's room number at St. Vincent's, and the name of the elementary school his daughter attended on the Upper West Side. No threat, no demands, no signature, just information, delivered like a fist to the throat. Ray DeLuca sat on the floor of his kitchen and did not move for 2 hours. The most dangerous trap is the one with no lock, because the man walks in on his own, looks around at what's waiting for him, and quietly locks the door himself. A back room on 119th Street. No windows. One bare bulb swinging from the ceiling on a wire, throwing shadows that crawled across the walls like something alive. The room smelled like mildew, cold sweat, and the particular stench of a man who has been sitting in his own fear for 3 hours. Ray DeLuca was zip-tied to a wooden chair. His shirt was soaked through. His left eye had a bruise forming beneath it, not from Bumpy's men, but from the doorframe he'd walked into in the dark when they brought him in. His hands were shaking against the armrests with a fine, constant tremor he couldn't control. Bumpy sat across from him with a reel-to-reel recorder on the table between them. No weapon, no raised voice. Just a man in a clean white shirt watching Ray the way a surgeon watches a patient before he cuts. "Nobody is going to hurt you tonight," Bumpy said. "But I need you to sit still and listen to something, because what you're about to hear is going to crack open everything you think you know about why you're in this room." Ray's eyes locked onto the recorder. His jaw worked silently. "Play it," he said. Bumpy pressed the button. The tape hissed. Voices rose out of the static. 2 men. A restaurant setting. Silverware scraping against plates in the background. The first voice was immediately familiar. Ray's stomach dropped 2 inches before the man even finished his first sentence. It was the voice of the man in the charcoal suit. The man from the hospital hallway. The man who had handed Ray the envelope that started all of this. Then the second voice came in. Older. Flat. The kind of voice that had ordered terrible things so many times it had stopped attaching any emotion to the words. Every serious man in New York would have recognized that voice. Ray recognized it in under 4 seconds. The first voice said, "And after DeLuca finishes the job, what happens to him?" A pause. A glass set down hard on a table. The second voice said, "DeLuca doesn't walk away. He's got 3 open cases the feds are already circling. If he completes the job and disappears quietly, he becomes a thread that unravels everything. Clean him up the same night. Make it look like Johnson's crew did the retaliation. His kid is still in the hospital," the first voice said. "Not our concern," the second voice replied. "It never was." The recorder clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. No jazz leaking under the door. No traffic from outside. Just the sound of Ray DeLuca's breathing, which had become the jagged, shallow gasping of a man who has just felt the floor dissolve beneath him. His face had gone gray. Not pale gray. The color of something that has had the life pressed out of it. His eyes were fixed on the recorder with an expression that went beyond shock into something almost childlike. The expression of a man realizing, all at once, that the people who handed him hope had engineered his destruction before he ever said yes. "That second voice," Bumpy said quietly, "belongs to the underboss who sits 2 chairs to the right of Genovese at every commission meeting. The recording was made 6 days ago at a restaurant on Mulberry Street. My man was at the next table with a recorder taped under his jacket." Ray's head dropped forward. His whole body shook once one hard convulsion, like something snapping loose deep inside his chest. "My son," he said. The words came out broken, barely above a whisper. "They used my son. They built the situation," Bumpy said. His voice was level, almost gentle, but his eyes were hard as stone. "The medical bills climbing past what you could handle. Your crew going cold on you, right when you needed them most. The man appearing at the hospital at 2 in the morning with exactly the right amount of money. Every piece of it was placed in front of you on purpose. You were selected because you were desperate, because you were documented, and because your death could be explained as collateral damage without anyone asking uncomfortable questions." Ray raised his head. His eyes were red and wet and burning with the specific, cold fury of a man who has been surgically betrayed by people he bled for. "What do you want from me?" His voice came out like gravel dragged across concrete. Bumpy leaned forward, close enough that Ray could smell his cologne, something clean and sharp. completely out of place in that rotting room. "I want you breathing," Bumpy said, "because a dead man can't sit across a table from a capo and confirm what's on that tape. And right now, you and that recording together are worth more than anything Genovese has left in this city." Men in that world had kept recordings before tucked in walls, buried in basements, handed to lawyers with instructions to insert certain envelopes if certain things happened. It was the oldest insurance policy in existence, and the only one that never expired. In this world, the most dangerous man is not the one holding the gun. It's the one who already knew you were disposable and kept the receipt. The Paradise Club on Lenox Avenue smelled like Cuban cigars burned down to the fingers, aged bourbon soaking into wood that hadn't been replaced since the 40s, and the faint metallic undertone of money changing hands in quantities that don't get deposited in banks. The lights were amber and low, the kind of lighting that made every man in the room look like he was sitting inside a confession booth. At the bar, a man with a broken nose nursed a drink and said nothing. At the back table, two men in identical dark suits talked without moving their lips much, the way men talk when they've spent years assuming someone is always listening. Bumpy walked in at 8 o'clock and sat in the center of the room. Not the corner, not the back, the center, visible to every set of eyes in the place. He ordered scotch and opened a newspaper like a man with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. By 8:15, every significant man in that room knew he was there. In these circles, information moved faster than sound. At 8:47, Sal Martino came through the door. Martino was 53 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been broken and reset at least twice and had never quite gone back to where it started. He ran a crew of 14 men and had been inside the Genovese structure for over 2 decades. He was not a man given to surprises, and the expression he wore crossing the room toward Bumpy's table made clear that being summoned because that was what this was, regardless of how politely it had been arranged, did not sit well with him. He sat down, said nothing, waited. Bumpy reached into his jacket and placed 3 items on the table in a single, unhurried motion. A photograph, a folded transcript, a second photograph. The first photograph is the man who walked into St. Vincent's Hospital 11 nights ago with $60,000 in a white envelope, Bumpy said. The transcript is a partial record of a conversation that took place 6 days ago on Mulberry Street. The second photograph is the man whose voice dominates that conversation. Martino looked at the items without touching them. A muscle in his jaw tightened once and released. "I'm not here to start a war," Bumpy continued. "I want you to hear that clearly because I know what you're thinking right now and I need you to set it aside. A war burns money, burns men, and puts all of our names in federal files that don't close. I have no appetite for that. What I have is information that directly threatens the safety of every crew operating under your structure, and I believe you deserve to know about a fire before it reaches your floor." Martino picked up the transcript. "Read it slowly." His face went very still, the particular stillness of a man absorbing something that is rearranging everything behind his eyes. He set the paper down. His voice came out careful and quiet, stripped of everything except the question itself. "Where is the shooter now?" "Safe, unharmed, ready to confirm every word on that tape in front of whoever needs to hear it." "Why keep him alive?" Martino asked. "That's not how this usually goes." Bumpy looked at him with an expression that carried no malice and no warmth, just absolute, surgical clarity. "Because I'm not interested in looking like the problem. I'm interested in showing you where the problem actually lives. There's a difference, and that difference is worth more to both of us than one dead body in an alley." Martino sat with that for a long moment. Outside, a truck downshifted hard on the avenue, its brakes grinding and squealing into the night. The piano player in the corner hit a chord, let it ring, and moved on. "I'll need to make some calls," Martino said. "Of course," Bumpy said. "But not too slowly." What followed inside the Genovese organization happened in darkness. The way all genuinely lethal things happen. Phone calls that went 2 hours unanswered. A meeting canceled without explanation. Men who had eaten at the same table for 20 years, suddenly watching each other's hands. The underboss whose voice lived on that tape began to feel the cold, not dramatically. Not all at once, but in the slow, creeping way that tells a man the ground beneath him has already started to give. Bumpy never raised his hand, never pulled a trigger, never made a single explicit threat. Losing face in front of your own men destroys something that no surgeon can repair because a bullet wound closes. But the moment your capos stop believing you, that wound stays open until it kills you. Mulberry Street, Little Italy, 11:43 p.m. The social club smelled like 40 years of cigar smoke pressed so deep into the walls it had become part of the plaster. Like espresso gone cold. Like the specific mustiness of a room where men have been dividing money and issuing sentences since before most of their grandchildren were born. A poker game ran at the center table, 4 men. Real stakes. The comfortable silence of people who have been reading each other's faces for decades. The cards were good. The whiskey was poured. Nobody was expecting anything. Then the front door opened. 2 men came in carrying a coffin between them, dark-stained wood, brass handles, full burial length, angling it carefully through the doorway and setting it down in the center of the floor with the impact that sent a shudder through the floorboards and landed like a punch in every man's chest simultaneously. The cards stopped moving. Chips sat untouched. 4 pairs of eyes fixed on the coffin with the wide, animal alertness of men whose bodies understood the threat before their minds caught up. Then the lid pushed open from the inside. Ray DeLuca sat up slowly. His face was pale and hollow-eyed, marked with 3 days of stubble and the particular expression of a man who has seen the bottom of something and is not entirely sure he has come back from it. He was alive, visibly, completely alive. He set a reel-to-reel tape on the edge of the coffin with both hands and looked at the floor. Ferraro, silver-haired, thick-necked, 31 years inside the organization, shoved his chair back so hard it screamed against the stone floor. His hand moved toward his jacket. "Don't," said a voice from the doorway. Bumpy Johnson walked in unhurried, hands visible, suit jacket buttoned. He crossed to the center of the room and stood beside the coffin the way a man stands at a podium like he had been given the floor and intended to use every second of it. He looked at each face in the room, took his time, let the silence stretch until it had weight. "I was told a coffin was being prepared with my name on it," he said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "I thought it was only fair to return the favor." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The only sound was the faint creak of the building settling and the distant noise of a taxi on the street outside. Bumpy picked up the tape from the coffin lid and held it up between 2 fingers. This recording contains a conversation between 2 men that most of you know by name. In that conversation, they authorize a hit on me, schedule the murder of the shooter immediately afterward, and plan to blame my organization for both deaths. The man sitting in this coffin heard that conversation and is prepared to confirm every word of it under any circumstances you require. Ferraro's face had gone the color of cigarette ash. His eyes moved from the tape to Ray to Bumpy and back again in rapid, involuntary jerks. The eyes of a man doing violent arithmetic in real time who approved this. Who knew? Who was already talking to the feds? Who is sitting at this table right now that I can no longer trust? The other 3 men at the poker table had not moved. They sat with the rigid, careful stillness of people who understand that the wrong gesture in the next 30 seconds could define the rest of their lives. "I don't want war," Bumpy said. "War is loud and expensive and it ends careers. What I want is for the right men to hear this tape and make the right decisions. That is all I want. Everything after that is your business, not mine." He set the tape back on the coffin, buttoned his jacket, walked to the door, paused with one hand on the frame, did not turn around. "The coffin is a gift," he said. "A reminder that the next one may not be empty." Then he walked out into the cold night air of Mulberry Street and disappeared. Inside the room, nobody spoke for nearly 3 full minutes. The poker chips sat where they had been abandoned. The whiskey glasses were untouched. Ray DeLuca sat in the open coffin with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor, breathing slowly, listening to the sound of powerful men sitting in complete silence, which is the loudest sound in the world when you know what it means. In that world, a bullet fired in anger could be absorbed, explained, avenged. But a man who walks through your door, opens a coffin in the middle of your room, and disassembles your authority without raising his voice that lands somewhere the body has no defense against. A boss does not fear the gun aimed at his chest. He fears the exact moment when his own men stop meeting his eyes, because that is when he knows the power he spent his whole life building has already moved to someone else's hands. Midtown Manhattan, a private room above a restaurant with no sign on the door and no record of the reservation. The room smelled like wool, hair oil, and the dry, pressurized stillness of a space where enormous decisions get made in very low voices. 6 men sat around a round table. No waitstaff, no windows. 1 bottle of water per man. Untouched. These 6 men controlled more of New York City than anyone who had ever been elected to anything. And not one of them had raised his voice in years. Shouting was for soldiers. The men in this room had stopped being soldiers a long time ago. The oldest man at the table, white-haired, thick-handed, with eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything, set his glass down and looked around the room slowly. 2 nights ago, a black man from Harlem walked into a social club on Mulberry Street, set a coffin on the floor in front of 3 of our capos, and walked out without a scratch on him. He said, "I want to hear how each of you understands what that means before anyone tells me what they think we should do about it." Silence, the kind that has weight. The man to his left spoke first. His voice was careful, measured. The voice of someone who understood that the wrong 3 words in a room like this one could cost him everything he had spent 20 years building. "The tape is real. The shooter is alive and confirmed everything. Ferraro and 2 others witnessed the delivery in person. This is no longer a rumor we can manage. It is a documented fact sitting in the hands of a man who has already demonstrated he knows exactly how to use it." The Brooklyn man across the table leaned forward. He was heavy-set, Sicilian, with the flat, patient expression of someone who had survived 50 years in this business by understanding one thing above all others. "We have 2 options," he said. "We go to war, or we go back to work." "Walk me through the war," the white-haired man said. "We authorize a full response against Harlem. We send every soldier we have north of 96th Street. We burn it down and we send a message to every independent operator in this city that nobody puts a coffin in one of our rooms and breathes afterward." He paused. Let that image sit. "And then we spend the next 3 years bleeding money while the FBI parks vans outside every one of our businesses. The newspapers run it every morning for 6 months. 2 of us get indicted. The numbers operation, which right now generates more clean cash than everything else we run combined, dies completely, because the people who play the numbers stop playing them when there are bodies rotting on their front stoops." The room was absolutely quiet. "The other option," the white-haired man said. "We acknowledge internally that the Genovese operation made a move that was stupid, unauthorized, and almost got us all dragged into a federal courtroom. We handle the responsible people ourselves, quietly, with no headlines. We confirm the existing arrangement in Harlem stays exactly as it is, and we go back to making money." The youngest man at the table, tight jaw, hard eyes, the specific fury of someone being asked to swallow something that tastes like humiliation, spoke without being called on. So we let him win. The Brooklyn man turned and looked at him with the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a child. He already won. He won the night he put that coffin on the floor and walked out of that room with every capo in it staring at his back. The only question left is whether we lose our money along with our pride. Or just our pride. The youngest man said nothing further. The vote moved around the table like a slow, heavy current. No raised hands, no formal count. Just nods, one after another, each one closing a door that would not reopen. Harlem stayed untouched. The arrangement held. The Genovese underboss, whose voice was on that tape, was removed from his position within 3 weeks. No announcement, no explanation, no ceremony. His chair was filled. His name stopped being said. He did not die, which in that world was considered a form of mercy, and also a message about what happened to men who created problems that cost the whole table money. Vito Genovese heard the outcome through channels. He said nothing, but the men who sat near him in the months after noted something new in the way he held himself, a slight tightening, a new stillness, the posture of a man who has discovered that the city he thought he owned had a room he had never been shown in any organization built on violence. Money is the only argument that never loses an election because you can replace a man. But you cannot replace a revenue stream that somebody else now controls. St. Vincent's Hospital, 6 a.m. The surgical ward smelled like antiseptic, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Stale coffee burned black at the bottom of a pot nobody had emptied since midnight. And underneath both of those faint, persistent, impossible to fully cover the Swedish rot of bodies fighting to stay alive in rooms designed to help them do it. The operating room door swung shut with a soft hydraulic click. Ray DeLuca sat in a plastic waiting chair with his elbows on his knees and his face buried in both hands. He had been sitting in that exact position for 2 hours. His shirt was soaked through across the back and under both arms. His shoes were untied. He looked like a man who had been turned inside out and left on a chair to dry. The hallway around him was nearly empty. A nurse moved past without looking at him. A cart with squeaking wheels rolled by somewhere out of sight. A fluorescent tube overhead flickered once and held. Then footsteps stopped in front of him. "Mr. DeLuca." Ray's head came up. The nurse in the doorway had the careful, composed expression of someone trained to deliver news of all varieties without letting her face tell you which kind is coming. "Your son is out of surgery. The procedure was successful. He's breathing on his own." Ray's mouth opened. His eyes went red and wet in under 2 seconds, not the slow buildup of a man starting to cry, but the sudden, uncontrollable release of a body that has been holding a dam closed for 3 weeks straight and has just been told it can stop. He pressed both fists against his mouth. His shoulders shook once. Hard. Like a building absorbing a shock wave. He didn't make a sound. 2 days later, a plain white envelope appeared in his mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Someone had placed it there by hand. Inside, a single index card with 4 words typed in clean black ink. "The bill is settled. The $60,000 balance at St. Vincent's Hospital was cleared by a cashier's check the following morning, drawn from a shell company in the Bronx that existed entirely on paper and whose paper trail ended at a wall that nobody with any sense was going to climb over. The billing administrator who processed it signed the receipt, filed it, and never mentioned it to anyone for the rest of his career. Ray's wife found out the ring was gone on a Thursday. She stood at the kitchen sink holding the empty jewelry box, and she didn't say anything for a long time. When she turned around, her face was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was the face of a woman who has just confirmed something she had been refusing to fully believe. "Tell me it's over," she said. Ray looked at her from across the kitchen. The table between them felt like a mile. "It's over," he said. "We're clear. I swear to you it's over." She held his eyes for 10 full seconds. Then she put the empty box down on the counter and walked past him toward the hallway. She did not slam any doors. She did not cry in front of him. She simply removed herself from the room in the quiet, devastating way that women remove themselves when they have decided to survive something rather than fight it. Ray retrieved the ring 3 weeks later from the pawn shop on Amsterdam Avenue. Paid cash from money he had earned doing legitimate work, the kind of work that takes longer and pays less and doesn't require you to sit in a back room with your wrists zip-tied to a chair. He slid it back onto her finger on a Tuesday evening without a speech, just placed it in her palm and held her hand around it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it on. Then she went back to washing the dishes. Neither of them ever spoke about where it had been. Being rescued does not rewrite what you were willing to become. The past sits in the body like a splinter, quiet and invisible until the moment it works its way back to the surface. Wells Restaurant, Harlem, July 7th, 1968. The place smelled like fried chicken crackling in hot grease, black coffee sitting too long on a burner, and the warm, lived-in smell of a room full of working people eating real food at the end of real days. The walls were close. The tables were small. The noise was constant and comfortable silverware against plates. Voices overlapping. A radio somewhere in the back playing something with horns. Bumpy Johnson sat at a table near the window, 62 years old, white-haired, moving with the careful, deliberate economy of a man whose body had begun presenting him with a long list of accumulated bills. He was laughing, not performing, not managing, not calculating, actually laughing, his head back, at something one of the men at his table had just said. The men around him were laughing too, and for a moment the table looked exactly like what it was: old friends. A Tuesday evening, a plate of food, the particular ease of men who have known each other long enough to stop being careful. Then Bumpy's right hand went flat on the table, his fingers spread wide against the surface, hard, sudden, like a man grabbing for something to hold on to. His face changed. Not dramatically. No gasp. No cry. No theatrical collapse. Just a quiet, terrible shift. Like a light going off behind his eyes from the inside. He leaned forward slowly. His shoulder hit the edge of the table. His coffee cup tipped and rolled and shattered on the floor, and the sound of it breaking cut through every other noise in the room like a blade. The men around him were on their feet before he finished falling. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was pronounced dead that morning. Heart failure. He had outlived every bullet, every contract, every man who had ever looked at him across a table and decided he needed to be removed from the board. Vito Genovese had been sitting in a federal prison in Missouri since 1959, brought down not by a rival's gun, but by a narcotics conviction. Sentenced to 15 years, his organization fracturing slowly from the inside while he sat in a cell and watched it happen through second-hand reports. He died in that prison on February 14th, 1969, 7 months after Bumpy, Valentine's Day, which was the kind of detail that would have made Bumpy smile. The coffin on Mulberry Street was never entered into any official record anywhere. No police report, no court transcript, no newspaper column. It existed only in the memories of the men who had been in that room. Men who carried it the way you carry something genuinely dangerous, close to the chest, untold. Because some stories are too loaded to repeat in a world where the wrong person hearing them could get you killed even 20 years after the fact. But the structure of Harlem in the decade following that night told its own story to anyone willing to read it. The arrangement held completely. No incursions. No attempts to redraw the lines. The operations Bumpy had built continued functioning with a steadiness that doesn't happen by accident. It happens when an understanding has been reached at a level deep enough that nobody with any sense wants to test it. The men who witnessed the Coffin that night went on to live various versions of the lives that men in that business live. Some died in prison. Some died violently in circumstances that were briefly investigated and quickly closed. Some died in their beds, old, surrounded by family members who were told their grandfather had been in transportation or real estate. But every one of them, when the name Bumpy Johnson came up in conversation in the years that followed, went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of men remembering something that had permanently recalibrated what they believed one person was capable of. Not a loud memory. A heavy one. The kind you feel in the chest rather than hear in the ears. Real power is not measured in how many people feared you while you were breathing. It is measured in how many years pass after you are gone before anyone is brave enough or foolish enough to touch the order you left behind. The records show the dates they died. The records do not show how they moved power before they did. If that night in 1957 happened exactly the way people who were there described it, then what walked out of that room on Mulberry Street wasn't a victory of bullets. It was a victory of control. Cold, precise, and completely invisible to anyone who wasn't in that room. In that world, you don't need to kill your enemy to destroy him. You just need to make him look weak in front of his own men. Once. That's all it takes. If you want more stories where power changed hands without a single shot fired, stay right here, because Harlem never ran on noise. It ran on order, and the men who understood that order outlasted every man who didn't. These stories were buried, never meant to be found. We dug them out of Harlem so you didn't have to.